Good morning, I'm Sarah from the local studies team at Calderdale Libraries. Today we're going to be talking about the Plug Riots of 1842. Now these happened across several weeks in industrial mill towns across Lancashire and Yorkshire, but we're going to be concentrating on 3 days of riots that happened in Halifax, where thousands and thousands of people marched from neighbouring towns like Todmorden, Hebden Bridge, Rochdale, Bradford and Huddersfield, all to convene in Halifax. To give a little bit of context to the Plug Riots, in May 1842 the People's Charter, which called for equal voting rights for all men, was defeated in Parliament for the second time running. This, along with increasing levels of poverty and decreases in wages, led to thousands of mill workers going on strike and marching across Lancashire and Yorkshire, where they emptied mill dams and removed the plugs from boilers. This became known as the Plug Riots. These riots were reported in several newspapers in great detail, so notably the Northern Star, which was a Chartist newspaper and was sympathetic to the cause, and also the local paper, which is the Halifax Guardian, which was much less sympathetic. On August the 13th, strikers from Halifax made their way to London Foot, where they met with marchers who'd come over from Todmorden and Lancashire. Together they all made their way back to Halifax, stopping by Wigley's Silt Mill at King Cross, where they raked out the furnaces and knocked the plugs out of the boilers. They were joined by the majority of women and girls who'd been working in the factory and turned out to join them. Around 3,000 protesters marched towards New Bank, where they were met by the military and read the Riot Act by a local magistrate. The crowd retreated but made their way to Crown Street, where they met about 6,000 people that had marched from Bradford. People were also continuing to march from Todmorden, so at this point the crowd was about 20,000. They all proceeded to march to North Bridge, where again they were met by the military and the Riot Act was read. The Plug Riots were really notable for the amount of women that were involved. In fact, when the Halifax Guardian reported on the North Bridge gathering, they said, "Perhaps the women at this encounter were the more violent of the two. Approaching the very necks of the horses, they declared they would rather die than starve, and if the soldiers were determined to charge, they might kill them." Despite such resistance from the women, the military still managed to disband the crowd and arrested several people. However, the protesters still managed to stop most of the mills in the area by forming small groups and making their moves when the police weren't looking. They entered the mills quickly and systematically, knocking the plugs out of the boilers without being arrested. The protesters again gathered around North Bridge, and this time they came across Rawson, one of the magistrates who was conducting the prisoners. He made the error of going underneath one of the arches and was met by a hail of stones thrown from above, which knocked him to the ground. At this point, the military who were surrounding him turned around and fired at the crowd. This image is taken from the Illustrated London News, which shows the scene at Northbridge. Later that evening and the following morning, mass meetings were held on Skircutt Moor, with around 15,000 to 20,000 people in attendance. A resolution was passed that people wouldn't return to work until the demands of the People's Charter had been met and until wages had returned to an 1840 level. It was also agreed that forces would be concentrated in Halifax, with small groups being sent to Todmorden, Bradford and Huddersfield via Elland. They managed to stop all the mills on the way. Meanwhile, the prisoners who'd been taken the previous day were being moved to Wakefield via Elland Station. They were met on Salterhebble Hill by a large group of people, mainly women, who attempted but ultimately failed to free the prisoners. This is another image from the Illustrated London News showing the scene at Salterhebble Hill. Later that day, the protesters began to gather on Haley Hill. The military were called for, and when they arrived, they were met by stones being thrown and a pistol being fired. The military were therefore ordered to fire into the crowd, which they did, and also the hussars charged up the hill with their sabres drawn. The crowd fled, but then they began to head for Bankfield and Ackroyd's Mill. The military again fired into the crowd and around 40 people were arrested. The vast majority of those arrested were local mill workers. They were listed in the Halifax Guardian, but some include John O'Brien, a wool spinner from Elland, Michael Beerstow, a weaver from Illingworth, Eli Hoyle, a weaver from Midgley, and John Greenwood, a comber from Haley Hill. I then searched the names of some of those that had been arrested on the criminal register on Ancestry and found around 8 pages of charges of seditious conspiracy and riot. As well as a list of prisoners, the Halifax Guardian also published a fairly graphic list of injuries obtained at the hands of the military. These included Jonathan Booth, a flag dresser from North Orham, shot through the abdomen, bladder supposed to be perforated, not expected to live the night. William Sutcliffe of Ovenden, right leg smashed just under the knee with a bullet so violently that a second fracture took place about 3 inches lower. He had to have his leg amputated. Samuel Crowther, nail-maker, shot through the abdomen. Henry Walton of Skircote, a sabre cut to the top of the head, the skull being cut for at least 6 inches in such a manner that the brain was quite perceptible, not expected to recover. Charles Taylor of Charlestown, a dreadful sabre cut which nearly severed his chin. As you can see, a lot of the injuries were pretty significant, and at least one man, Jonathan Booth, died from his injuries the following night. I wanted to find out a little bit more about him, so I started off by looking on Ancestry and Find My Past, and managed to find a burial record for him, and found out that he's buried at North Orham Independent Chapel. I then had a look back at the newspapers to see if I could find an inquest report to his death, and found one in the Northern Star. The inquest report in the Northern Star reports that he was shot with a gun wound entering the right side and coming out the front when the military fired onto the crowd near Ackroyd Mill. Interestingly, it also says that Archdeacon Musgrove said that Booth had spoken to him, maybe as part of his last rites or something, but that he was a spectator at a great distance from the road and wasn't involved in the rioting. So once the military had fired on the crowd and they'd basically fled, things actually seemed to settle down quite quickly. So the military paraded all around Halifax town and ordered people to stay inside and for pubs to close. And whilst people sort of drifted off towards the moors, there were no mass gatherings like there had been the day earlier. And by the next morning, factories were actually starting to open again. So things seemed to go back to normality quite quickly, although there were periods of agitation and particularly Chartist action throughout the next few years. There was nothing, again, quite on this scale. I hope you found our short film interesting. If you want to find out more information, then once the library reopens, I'd highly recommend Catherine Howe's book, Halifax 1842, A Year in Crisis. But up until that point, there's plenty of electronic resources to be going on with. So the Northern Star is available through 19th century British newspapers, and that's great for looking up stuff about working class movements and working class agitation. It covers Calderdale, but also Lancashire, Yorkshire and beyond. The other thing that would be fascinating would be to find out a bit more about what happened to some of the people who were arrested or some of the people who were injured. So you could do that by looking on Ancestry or Find My Past, both of which are available for free through the library at home. You could look at the criminal records register, also births, marriages and deaths to find out when they died, did they get married, did they have children, or maybe one of you is related to one of them. We'd be really fascinated to find out if that was the case. Comment below or drop us an email at reference.library@calderdale.gov.uk. And until we see you in person, then take good care and keep an eye on social media for more stuff happening from the libraries online.